Oh.
The glasses.
Fake
glasses.
There's a sheep. The castle. Huh?
Hi, Elizabeth.
Wave, Sarah. And Uncle Mike's and Aunt Kathy's car. There's Grandma. And there is a beautiful. There's my dad. Okay. Well, getting ready to drive.
Elizabeth, you see my dad?
This is gorgeous. We won't be able to find them. We'll find them in the public drive. Oh,
Oh. Are they petunias?
probably I don't know what they eat anymore.
They look like. It's the castle. I don't know what it's called, but here's the castle. The door. Dad.
When it says record, it's recording.
It's 50 meters tall, I think.
Come on. Yeah. Come on.
Mondjuk a fűbe beleállsz, belementál, nem
Na, de a Tomlik vigyázz.
Ugolj ott le!
Vigyázz, mert omlik.
Hi, Dad.
Jó volt, az előbb jobb voltál. Nem, az előbb, amikor egy... Megy! Megy! Hosszú hajú volt, hosszú hajú volt.
Lány vagy fiú? Fiú. Rövid hajú volt, négy.
Dad, do you want to go in the castle?
Jó.
I'll go find out if it's accurate. I told her, she asked how many adults, I said 6 adults, 3 children, so she gave us 1 family group and 2 extra adults.
Okay, so what do we need? Nothing.
And she said,
Aspetta fuori, Camilla. Aspetta fuori le sciotoline.
It's windy out here, Mom. That's why I'm shaking.
He was associated with the area of the town and the rock for a further 20 years or so, before eventually in 1002 going on to become the famous High King of Ireland. Just less than 100 years later, in 1101, the Rock of Cashel was handed over to the church as a gift. So indeed it wasn't always just a residential castle for kings. Since the beginning of the 12th century, it became the seat of bishops and archbishops, and all of the 5 buildings on site today are ecclesiastical or church-type structures. Now, 2 of the buildings date from the 12th century, the Round Tower and Cormac's Chapel. We also have a 13th century Gothic cathedral and 2 15th century buildings, the Archbishop. This was formerly the residence of the cathedral choir, dates back to the 12th century, like the 2 of the buildings here on the rock, and it's over 850 years old. It's called a lamp cross. It's very unusual, and of course it's very different to many Celtic crosses that you may have noticed on your travels around the country. Now, traditionally Celtic crosses have a large circle or wheel up in the top upper structure, but as you can see, this consists of one central piece that is supported on the right. Be strict, and actually the singing continues many times daily outdoors.
These days you over the wall.
Many armies, raiders or invaders were seen making their way here through those forest areas to the Rock of Cashel. A bronze bell which was placed high up at the top of the tower inside the conic cap was immediately sounded, and this notified the important clergy site to gold chalices, silver books and manuscripts. For protection then the doorway was moved inside and covered the doorway with 2 thick posts. Now, given the fact that the walls at the bottom of the round tower are around 3 feet thick, now structurally the tower consisted of 5 wooden floors, and there was a ladder and a trapdoor between each of the 5 floors, allowing the inhabitants to move appropriately. Each floor, as you can see, also has a window which faces different angles of the tower. The tower consists of 126 circular rings of unmortared stone. The stone is unmortared because all of the blocks of sandstone and limestone. This round tower tapers as it progresses the distance of 92 feet upwards, and that means that as the walls move up, they actually curve inwards. So the diameter at the bottom of the round tower is about half a foot thicker than that of the diameter of the top. The building stood alone in the 12th century. What you can see to your left-hand side of the tower is part of the north transept of our large, expensive Gothic Cathedral of St. Patrick. Now, so basically, when they were building the cathedral 100 years later, they joined it through the inside of the round tower using a second secret entrance or secret passage.
To be 100 years old.
And that's why they said that they put the heavy sound in the because they were afraid to marry.
Bye. Grandma. Yeah. Am I? Go. In the bathroom. And Uncle Mike. And this is the kitchen.
Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello. Outside.
But you think one of them would stick up their head to say hello to you because they're... Well, then I bet another one because they're very nosy. They keep watching the tourists and the tourists keep watching them. Everybody knows who's the crazy.
Brush them down and wash them
Wash
down.
them down with the hose them down.
Sure, clean them up.
But I never saw her sweating so much as today. It must be very close or humid or something today.
You and I.
Maybe that's where they got through with it, where he got tangled in there.
Again? Dublin?
Yep, from Dublin.
Okay.
I have a question too.
What?
Alright. Would this shirt look right with this skirt?
Yeah, it's working fine.
Shuffling our travel documents.
Last night in the cottage for the Neapolitan, off to England.
They couldn't be happier.
We were just discussing that.
There's Grandma. I'm going in for the Saturday matinee.
Morning, Elizabeth.
Now, then at the foundation of the Irish state, we run into other difficulties because at the foundation of the state, the Catholic Church had extraordinary influence. Now, there were many aspects of this influence that were positive, but there were also negative sides to it because the Catholic Church had an abhorrence of Protestantism. And part of the rule was that Catholic students did not allow to go. They had to go and be interviewed by the Archbishop of Dublin. And he decided whether or not they could, with special permission, go there. And that was the case here up until 1970. Then in the 60s, everything in Irish society began to change. Because up until the 60s, Ireland would have been a very rural and very insular society. A small country on the western seaboard of Europe, farming was in a very primitive state, and the country was incredibly poor. There was mass immigration at that point out of Ireland. But in the 60s, the government introduced free high school education. So instead of children leaving school at 14, they stayed on and graduated from high school. And now that they graduated from high school, they went on and went to university. And that was the new student in the 60s who was sort of beginning to question, well, what's this got to do with the bishop, which university I go to? So the new students came here and didn't bother with the bishop at all. Not alone that, but they then challenged the Archdiocese of Dublin as to why they ever had these laws in the first place. So here we begin to see Ireland becoming a more questioning society. So it's really the students leading the parents. And of course, Ireland would not be in isolation here. They would have been influenced by the debates in Berkeley University, the civil rights movement in the United States, the hippie movement. All of that played its role. In France, you had the riots in the universities of France, Czechoslovakia, the civil rights movement of Northern Ireland. They were all part of the same story. So that was the change in Irish society. That's where we see the beginning of it, where the church is now being challenged, because it really had a stifling influence on the people. I mean, whatever the priest said, the priest said. It was never to be questioned. But the young 60 student was not prepared to accept that. And then, of course, you had the women in the 60s who, of course, led the debate on the contraceptive pill, which got them into so much conflict with the Catholic Church in Ireland. So here we see everything is beginning to change. Also in the 60s, the government recognized that Ireland's economic future would not lie in agriculture, that this was not really, the immigration would continue on a massive scale. So the government recognized that Ireland's economic future would lie in the field of science and technology. So an educational system was introduced in the 60s to gear us towards the future in science and technology. That is the reason for the economic success that we have today. That was the decision made in the 60s to change the educational system towards science and technology, without, of course, losing our classical style of education, which meant that when the multinationals wanted to locate overseas, Ireland looked a very interesting option. It was English-speaking, it was part of the European Union, tax-free until 1990, and a 10% tax on their profits after 1990, But the biggest deal of all was that they also had a workforce that already spoke the language of science and technology. So all of the multinationals eventually came here, and today we are the highest exporter of software in the world outside of the United States. So that would be part of our economic success today. And of course, our economic success is so good that 2 years ago we were in a position to introduce free university education. So now all university education is free. Now, the building here on the right-hand side, this was the old House of Parliament when Ireland was under British rule. Now, Ireland was under British rule from 1169 until 1921. So in 1727, England decided that they had great difficulties ruling what one might loosely call the unruly Irish. So they decided, well, if we have a parliament in Dublin, that will in some way placate the Irish. So the parliament was established here in 1727. The problem was that the members of parliament all came from the ruling classes because they were Protestants. You see, Catholics were not allowed to hold high office, which in effect meant that 90% of the population of Ireland were excluded from being in this parliament. But they were the very ones who then challenged the British government over having these laws in the first place. So the government now have a new problem. They have a parliament set up here to help them have a smoother running in Ireland, but the members of parliament are now the ones who are against them. So that was one problem facing the British. The other problem was the American War of Independence and the French Revolution. Both of those had a profound effect on Ireland, and that led to a revolution here supported by the French in 1798. So England now had to reassess the whole notion of this parliament. What advantages were there to England having a parliament in Dublin? You now have dissident members of parliament and a revolution on your hands. So England decided to abolish the parliament in 1801, when the famous Act of Union of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales was signed. Now, one man who bitterly opposed the signing of the Act of Union was a man called Henry Grattan. And his argument was, he said, I know it's an English parliament, but nonetheless it is a parliament, and it gives us access to the diplomatic process to achieve our ultimate goal, which is Irish independence. If we abolish the parliament and we still want independence, the only course open to us is revolution. And he chose not to go down the revolutionary path. But the tides were out for Henry Grattan, the Act of Union was signed, and we were again under the direct rule of Westminster until 1921. So we did eventually achieve independence, but it was not through the diplomatic process, it was through revolution. And both England and Ireland paid a very heavy price for that independence when it was finally achieved. How different our history would have been had we listened to Henry Grattan, because we would have eventually seen the peaceful transfer of power from Britain to Ireland, and we would never have had to deal with the diabolical problems of Northern Ireland that has cost everybody so much over the last 30 years. A very different Ireland would have evolved. And it's one of the arguments why the Ulster Unionists should 2 weeks ago have set up the Parliament in the North. The Ulster Unionists refused to sit in Parliament because of Sinn Féin, who are the political wing of the IRA, and they said they won't sit in Parliament with a political party that also has its own private army. Well, that's perfectly understandable. But by not sitting in Parliament, there is a lot more damage being caused. Because at least if you have the Parliament there, you have all the parliamentary structures there. There are other issues in the north of Ireland that are not just whether the north should be British or Irish. There are all the other issues that the Parliament would need to deal with. And by dealing with other issues, it might make their differences less obvious to one another. So that was a golden opportunity missed, because there's no Parliament now and the IRA are still there. Would it not be better to create the climate in the north to make decommissioning an easier option? But of course that's fraught with, there are many views on that, of course. But anyway, it's interesting that our previous history was quite similar. So the building today is used as the headquarters of the Bank of Ireland. Coming up here on the left-hand side, we have the main entrance to Trinity College, and the statues flanking the main entrance, one is of Edmund Burke and the other Oliver Goldsmith. They're both graduates of the college. Grafton. Street, in front of us. Gallivanting around the city, she got a statue to herself and blessed by the bishop. What more does one want? We call her the tart with the cart. William of Orange. He was Prince of Orange, Count of Nassau, and King of England. Coming up on the right, the Fred Hanna bookstore. And coming up on the right, we have the Kilkenny shop. On your right-hand side, excellent for shopping. Now, as we turn right here, for those of you who are of Irish, this is the genealogy office, just immediately in here on the left. And remember, the less you know about them, the more it's going to cost you. Then you spend all your money finding the relations. Right-hand side is closed, of course, for the summer holidays. Coming up here on the left is our National Museum. This has the most important gold collection in Europe, is in our National Museum. Coming up on the right here, we have the home of the author of Dracula, Bram Stoker. Very much came from his grandmother. For the writing of Dracula came from his grandmother. Though it's not set in Ireland, it's certainly Irish in its, it's very closely related to Irish folklore. Coming up here on the left is the Shelburne Hotel. This is the leading hotel of the city, the Shelburne Hotel in Dublin, on the left-hand side. Now, as we make our way down here, in a moment we will be O'Donoghue's pub. This is the most famous of all the pubs in Dublin, O'Donoghue's. Coming up here on the left, there's another famous pub, Foley's. The place is full of pubs. Now, notice now the wide streets and the tall buildings. These are the lovely buildings of the city, the Georgian buildings, built during the reign of the Hanoverian kings between 1711 and 1820. Coming up on the left is the Department of Finance, and coming up here on the left we have the office of our Prime Minister. We don't use the term Prime Minister here, we use the term the Taoiseach, meaning the chief, the Taoiseach, the deputy chief. And coming up on our left-hand side here, now the House of Parliament here again on the left, when this was first built, it was built as a private home for the Dukes of Leinster, Leinster House. Built as a private home. And it became the House of Parliament. Cosgrave took that over as the House of Parliament when he became Prime Minister in 1922. Coming up here on the, and Sir William Orpen. Now one man to mention here at our gallery is Sir Hugh Lane. He was curator of this gallery at the turn of the century. Now, Sir Hugh Lane had a wonderful collection of the works of the Impressionists, and after he was made curator of the gallery, he decided to leave his complete collection to them, which he did. But the other board of directors, they did not really consider Impressionism as art. And he was very angered by their attitude, and he changed his will in favour of the National Gallery in London that had recently acquired works of the Impressionists. But it was an unwitnessed codicil to his will. So Hugh Lane was drowned on the Lusitania, which was torpedoed by a German submarine off the old head of Kinsale in County Cork in 1915, one of the reasons that brought America into the First World War. And from 1916 until 1965, there was a dispute as to who, in fact, were the rightful owners of the Lane collection. And in 1965, they came to a very interesting compromise. Ireland got half the collection, England got the other half, and we swapped them over every 5 years. So that was a rather nice story of compromise. One other man to mention at the gallery is George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw loved this gallery as a child. George Bernard Shaw wrote Pygmalion, and on that was based the story of My Fair Lady. And as part of the estate of Shaw went to the National Gallery, they enjoyed a windfall from My Fair Lady. Two recent acquisitions to the gallery is a Vermeer painting, part of the Dutch collection, and it's the most important collection of Dutch masters outside of Holland. And the jewel in the crown is a Caravaggio. This was painted in Rome in 1603 by Caravaggio for the Mattei family. Now Caravaggio perfected what we call caro scuro, light and shade, and he was much in demand as a young Italian artist. However, at the age of 34, Caravaggio murdered somebody. So people who had his works now did not feel terribly comfortable. So eventually the works became Dutch. And this particular one was sold in Edinburgh at the turn of the century as a Dutch master for £8. It was bought by a Dublin family who in the 1950s presented it to the Jesuit fathers, who 3 years ago brought it here to the gallery to have it cleaned, still assuming that it was a Dutch painting. However, one of the directors or curators of the gallery here is an Italian, and he's a leading expert on the works of Caravaggio. And lo and behold, here was the missing link in Caravaggio's work. It hangs there now at a price tag of 50 million. Now, Oscar Wilde lived here from the age of 2. He studied at Trinity. His parents were very interesting. His mother was a journalist. His father was an eye surgeon, anthropologist, and archaeologist. He studied at Trinity, later went to England where he studied at Oxford, fell in love with the son of the Marquis of Queensberry. Born out of that was the picture of Dorian Gray. The Marquis of Queensberry called it a sodomist. He sued him for libel, and the trial of Oscar Wilde exposed his homosexuality, which he was later jailed, the home of Oscar Wilde. And it was outside there that James Joyce had his first date with Nora Barnacle, a woman who was to play such an important role in his life, and they married much later in life. Now, the rich and famous of the city, the Connoscenti of Dublin, would have lived in these houses during the 17 and 1800s, when Dublin was the second city of a vast empire. These banks. There on the left is the National Maternity Hospital. This is not our usual traffic, let me tell you. Coming up here on the left-hand side, these lovely houses. If you look at the doors and the lovely fan lighting above the doors, they're very, very beautiful. And then the colour of the doors, well, the families who lived here, this was their preference of colour. Whereas in Bath and Edinburgh, the other two Georgian cities, they tended to maybe tone down the colours a little bit. Now, if you look left and right there again, you'll see the scale of the city. It was very beautifully designed. But then along comes the 1960s. So here on the left, you see the 1960s building, where they tore down all the lovely Georgian architecture and built this awful stuff here on the left. And of course, the argument in the 60s was that this was... Now, as we call it, she's the woman on the £5 note. A very important teaching order of nuns. Catherine Macaulay started life as a very wealthy girl. She recognised that the only way out of the slums was education, and she set up schools for girls. The house down on the left, in off the road, the beige building, that's the world headquarters of the Irish Sisters of Mercy. Now, as we turn right here, there is a house on the left that's still in private ownership, number 2, just here on the left-hand side. Owned by Dr. Tony O'Reilly, who's chairman of Heinz Food Park. It's owned by the people who own these houses. They also, that's their private park on the left. So architecturally, this area is of great importance. They stay open until about 6 in the morning. And that's where you'd meet all the men whose wives don't understand them. Now, there's some very good schools along here. The Catholic University School and Loretto on the Green, another famous girls' school here. The right-hand side, coming up on the right-hand side, St. Stephen's Green, one of the most beautiful little parks in the city. We'll go straight on here, Philip, today. There on the left-hand side, we have the Guinness family home, and here... Now we're coming into, this is a very poor area of the city, so we have a complete contrast now from the very wealthy area to the very poor area. would have the third highest standard of education in Europe, in Ireland. And it's quite interesting that that doesn't really extend to the inner city of Dublin, because very few of the children here go on to university. Very few. Yeah. Well, you see, the picture's even worse than that, because it was always free if you were under a certain income. There were no university fees here anyway, if people were below a certain income. So that makes the situation even worse, because, you see, they really didn't have to pay university fees, so fees were never an issue. Also, if you take outside of the city, people going on to university, they would also have to pay for accommodation, because accommodation isn't free. But the kids in the inner city of Dublin wouldn't have had to worry about accommodation. So they had more advantages than over the other kids, and yet not even that helped in changing the surround. Coming up here on the right, this is part of the council housing of the city here. This is low-income housing here. So when the people first moved in here, people with disabilities got priority, people with walking aids and crutches got priority. And then after a few months, all the walking aids and crutches disappeared. So we call this area here Lourdes. Coming up on the left-hand side now, we have St. Patrick's Cathedral. We're now going to Patrick, built the first church in Ireland. St. Patrick being our patron saint. But this is not a Catholic cathedral, it is Episcopal. So now we're going in here to visit. Behind the stained glass. In the choir area there are three figures in stained glass. In the centre is St. Patrick, to the left is St. Columba, and to the right is St. Bridget. And they are co-patron saints of Ireland. St. Patrick brought us the Christian religion in the year 432 AD. St. Columba, he brought the Christian religion to the island of Iona in Scotland, and he also brought the recipe for whiskey to the Scots, came from the Irish monks. And St. Bridget, she founded a very important monastery in Ireland, but she gets marginalized because of all the men, but she's also very important. They represent our golden age, which was from the 5th to the 9th century, when Ireland was known as the island of saints and scholars. And students came from all over Europe to study in the great Irish monasteries. Because when Europe had its dark ages, with the decline of the western section of the Roman Empire, that was Ireland's golden age. You see, Ireland was not invaded by the Romans, so we did not suffer from the decline of the Roman Empire. So we had our golden age as they had their dark age. And the great seats of learning of that time would have been Cordoba in Spain, Baghdad, Cairo, and Ireland. They were the great centres of learning during that period. So that represents that golden age. But sadly, that came to an end with the arrival of the Vikings, who came here from Norway and from Denmark. The flags of monasteries here, they belong to the Knights of St. Patrick, and they are a noble order. You had the Order of the Garter in England, the Order of the Thistle in Scotland, and the Order of St. Patrick in Ireland. The oldest of the three orders is the Order of the Garter, which was founded in 1348 during the reign of King Edward III of England. Now, it's a rather unusual name for such an illustrious order, but one night at a banquet in Windsor Castle, the garter of the lady-in-waiting fell down, and the king picked it up. And everybody started smiling, because they were wondering, if they all knew he was having an affair with this one. So you'd wonder, what's all this fuss about poor old Prince Charles? Because, you know, if you compared him to his ancestors, you could canonize the man tomorrow. He said, evil to him who evil thinks. He said, one day I shall make this the highest order in the land. So the new knights that he was installing, he calls them the Knights of the Garter, and that is their motto to this day. The Order of the Thistle in Scotland, and the Order of St. Patrick in Ireland. Now this order was established here in 1783 during the reign of King Edward III, during the reign of King George III, the one who lost the colony, as the English would say, but you may not see it quite like that. This order no longer exists as we are no longer under British rule, but these flags would have belonged to prominent members. The one on the left is that of Queen Victoria, the one on the right, Queen Victoria's third son, the Duke of Connaught, who was the first English prince to hold an Irish title. Now this cathedral dates from 1190. During the 1300s this was a university, and it survived as a university for about 150 years. Then due to lack of finance it closed, and Dublin did not have a university again until Trinity College was built in 1591. During the Reformation this became part of the Reformed religion. During the Cromwellian Wars, Cromwell used this building to stable his horses. Just to give you an idea of the mentality of the Cromwellian soldiers. So by the 1700s, a lot of restoration was necessary. When Ireland was under British rule, if we had any visiting heads of state, they would have their official service here. And the last British monarch to come to Ireland was King George V and Queen Mary in 1911. That was the last official visit of a British monarch to Ireland. And the reason why a visit hasn't taken place since, it's not all to do with security, it would also have to do with our constitution. Because in 1921, we signed a treaty with England, and the deal was that 26 counties would be part of a free state, but the 6 counties of Northern Ireland would remain under British rule. Now, the leader of the day was Eamon de Valera. He was not in England for those discussions. Michael Collins went there instead. Collins signed the treaty, but de Valera did not agree with it. De Valera said you went to London to negotiate the island of Ireland, not 26 counties. And Lloyd George refused to give the North. And the reason the North was the problem was that's where all the industry was. You had the Harland and Wolff shipyards there, you had all of the industry in the north. So anyway, the treaty was signed in 21, and that plummeted Ireland into a futile civil war. That was lost or won, depending how one looks at the north. And then we had the setting up of the Free State here in 1922 under the leadership of W.T. Cosgrave. Then in 1932, de Valera got into power, and he still refused to recognize the Treaty of 1921. So he suggested that it's the 32-county Ireland, not the 26-county Ireland. Article 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution give us jurisdiction over the north. The problem with that is the Queen's official title is she's Queen of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. Our President's title, she's President of Ireland. She's not President of the Republic of Ireland. She's President of Ireland. And as President of Ireland, she's also guardian of the Irish Constitution, which states that it's 32 counties, not 26 counties. That's the reason why the visit hasn't taken place. Now, in all of the flags, I'll give you time to walk around on your own, but just all of the flags that are in that corner there, they're flags of the various regiments of the British Army, of the Irish who fought in the British forces. Because remember, we were under British rule for 800 years. So as well as fighting the British, there were many Irish who fought in the British Army. The Irish who fought in the Boer War, the China War, the Burma War, the First World War. And there's a plaque there to the Irish who fought in the Second World War. Now, for those of you a little more clued into our history, that should beg a question, because we were actually a neutral country during the last war. And the reason for our neutrality is again to do with the Constitution. Eamon de Valera refused to join with the Allies if the Allies included England, because England had an army of occupation in Northern Ireland. That was the reason for our neutrality. But de Valera is a very complex character to discuss, because you see, he signed the Book of Condolences in the German embassy on the death of Hitler. And that got overthrown to just about everybody. It's argued that he was ill-advised, which really wouldn't hold a lot of weight, because de Valera was a leader, he was not a follower. He could take advice and make up his own mind. So, what that's all about is very complex. And he's a very complex character in history because De Valera is either loved or despised. If you bring up his name here, it involves incredible emotion of the older generation. The younger generation, De Valera, will probably not fare so well. Probably won't fare so well. But he's a very complex character of Irish history. Now, the First World War, that was an interesting period because the First World War was also our war of independence. So I suppose if we were to pick any time to take on the British during the First World War was obviously the one to do it. They were all fighting in Europe. So we had a revolution here in 1916. But if you look at it then from a woman's point of view, it's a very awkward time because just prior to the First World War, many Irish towns would have been garrison towns. So many people in the town would have been in the British Army. Now, of the officer class, the officers would have they would have been in the army because they would have enjoyed Ireland being under British rule, they would have toasted the monarch, they were quite happy. But of the working class Irish, they would have joined the army for a trade and for a job. They were not ideologically disposed one way or the other. But then the First World War broke out and all these men were sent to fight in Europe. So if you look at this from a woman's point of view, women had to deal with a son in the IRA, a son in the British Army, a father in the IRA, a husband in the British Army. A girl could have a boyfriend in the British Army and her brother in the IRA. So it was a rough time for women. And yet when the war was over, the onus was on the women of Ireland to get these men back together again. And we owe a great debt to the women of Ireland, the job they did after the war, because their attitude was, I don't care what happened in the Somme, I don't care what happened in the Dardanelles, we are first and foremost a family, regardless of what went on in Europe. So we owe them a great debt, and yet none of them were ever interviewed, none of them were ever asked their opinions, how they dealt with all that division in a small town. I mean, that could have been that could have continued for years and years and years, because there would be no greater divide in Irish history than a British soldier and an IRA man. And to think that women have to deal with that in every town and village in Ireland. So we certainly owe them a great debt. Now, so the flags that hang here are to the Irish regiments that fought in the British forces. Now, traditionally, Irish people never recognized that because that was the same army we fought. In fact, traditionally, they're looked at as the flags of the enemy. But in more recent years, our previous president, Mary Robinson, she came here on Armistice Day and laid a wreath to remember the Irish who died fighting in the British forces. That was followed by members of our government. And then the culmination of that was last year when our present president, Professor Mary McAleese, she went to France and unveiled a monument in Flanders with the Queen of England to remember the Irish who died in the British Army. So that's a complete turnaround in our history. And that's sort of the new beginning in Ireland. That's very evident if you were to talk to the younger generation of Irish people. They're not anti-British. They are not pro the Catholic Church. They are not interested in United Ireland. They would not see that as an issue at all. To them, they're quite happy with 36 counties. They would judge the North as being a very dysfunctional place, and they wouldn't be interested in taking it on. And that was proved last year when we had our referendum, that 95% of the people of the Republic voted to remove our constitutional claim on the North. If you consider that 50% of the population of Ireland are under the age of 28, 52% of the Irish population. The economy in the North would be superb. Well, you see, the North is always richer than the South because you have those shipyards and the linen industry. No, we would be way ahead. If you're comparing it North to South, our economy has surpassed almost all the economies in Europe, not just the North of Ireland. We are the leading economy of Europe in terms of progress. We're not the leading economy, obviously, but in terms of progress we are. So, so a very different South. And you see, with affluence, you see a difference. The youngsters here are interested in their future. They're not interested in their past, which was the reverse. And one of the great failings of Irish people was the respect they had for their past. I don't know whether you're of Irish descent, whether that was passed on in your homes. But there was an unbelievable respect for the past. I suppose it was the way of dealing with the present if things weren't good. you sort of look towards the past. Whereas the younger generation here, whilst they are interested in it from a historical perspective, they're not emotionally connected to it. You ask them, they say, I don't want to know the North. Who wants that crowd there that can't get along with one another? Why would we want them? You know, some of them don't want us, so we don't need them coming down here. So that feeling is very strong, very, very